With Deku and Miles Morales being right around the corner, I thought now would be the perfect opportunity to review the previous My Hero Academia episode that got uploaded to this season, Shigaraki versus Mahito. So let's not waste any time and just get into this one. So, Shigaraki versus Mahito. If I'm being honest, I don't think I really have all that much to say about the matchup because I do find it to be pretty straightforward. You've got two big baddies from two Battle Shonen universes. They're also described as iconic villains, but I'll put that somewhat in air quotes for now. But another thing they say about this matchup, at least in regards to what the Death Battle Wiki says, is other than the fact that they're two big villains with hand motifs, is they also are two characters that can end you with just a touch. And of course, as is the nature of the Death Battle fans, they just can't help themselves, and them and Death Battle have to pick two characters that, of course, have a hand motif going on. And you better believe that does play into the actual fight itself, but we'll get into that later when we actually talk about the fight. But another thing I'll say is, at least in regards to Mahito and Shigaraki, they at least take two characters from fodder universes and at least put them against opponents that could realistically fight each other, because there's one thing I hate is when Death Battle takes two characters where one is clearly more powerful than the other and either has that character lose or just has that character on the other side just be at a massive disadvantage. Lord knows we've seen how that's played out time and time again. But at least in regards to this matchup, it's like, okay, you at least got two canon fodder universes fighting each other. And yes, JJK fans, the Jujutsu Kaisen universe is not very powerful. Don't let Gojo try to put up the illusion that Jujutsu Kaisen is a powerful universe. It's just as fodder as My Hero Academia or Hunter x Hunter. If anybody from JJK walked into any other universe like Naruto or Bleach or even One Piece, they're gonna get the utter living crap beaten out of them. But I digress. So at least there's no vast power disparities. Although it is worth noting that even when you put Mahito against a weaker Battle Shonen character like Shigaraki, there is still a tiny bit of a gap, but not by much. So I'll at least give Death Battle that. And I would say these two characters at least play off of each other pretty well, and I cannot stress this enough, even though they're both set up to us as two characters that can kill with just a touch, thank God they don't have the same powers. I mean, they have somewhat similar abilities, such as like super strength and things like that, and the ability to like bring people into these little like domain expansions or like mental realms or whatever. But for the most part, this isn't set up to us as like, have these two characters fight because they have the exact same power or are the exact same thing. Cough, Spawn versus Ghost Rider. So at least they don't do that, and it is interesting to see how these two characters' different powers, such as Mahito's transmutation, goes up against Shigaraki's abilities, most importantly his decay ability. So at least they didn't do something stupid like have Shigaraki go up against Baragon from Bleach or something like that, because they both have decay powers. So I can at least give it that, and I do think that these two characters, given the circumstances, play off of each other decently. So, yeah, I think that's about all I have to say about the matchup. I'll say this matchup is fine. I don't know if I would say Mahito is the perfect opponent for Shigaraki, but then again, I would actually have to look deeper into see if there is a better opponent for either Mahito or Shigaraki. But either way, the matchup here is fine. perfectly serviceable. I really have no like major issues with it. Unlike other matchups like Spawn versus Ghost Rider, where I actively hate everything about the matchup. So let's move on to part 2, shall we? Now, in regards to the research and analysis, I would have to say this one is pretty solid. They do a very accurate job scaling both characters. There is no examples of highballing or lowballing that I can see, because I've watched this episode at least 3 or 4 times, and I did some prior research on these characters before recording this video. And from what I can gather, you got Shigaraki, who is maybe country to continental, and sub-relativistic to light speed, and Mahito, who ranges from likely city block to maybe town level, maybe city level at the most, but that's about it. And then Mahito is also around sub-relativistic, maybe slightly above massively hypersonic plus, which is good because normally in the worst death battle episodes, we will often see examples of death battle either heavily highballing a character or heavily lowballing a character. Thankfully, they don't do that here, so there is no egregious examples that I can see. And they also do a good job of going over the lore and characterization of each character. Although, on a quick unrelated note, why is it that Boomstick can't seem to say Shigaraki's name correctly? I think at one point in the episode he says Jigaraki instead. Really, Boomstick, was it so hard to learn how to say the character's name before recording? Is it really that hard to say Shigaraki? I mean, I guess I could see how it would be possible for somebody to accidentally stumble and say Jigaraki, but whatever, I guess. Just an example of how sometimes the comedy doesn't always work, and I don't even know if that was even an example of Boomstick trying to be funny. I think he legitimately just fucked up on his voice recording, but that's neither here nor there. Now,
what are you clenching in that fist there?
Well, that was sadder than what I was going for. Well, at least it's over.
In regards to the research, I see no real problems here. They do a good job accurately going over each character's unique abilities. So, yeah, I would say that the research here, perfectly fine. And let's move on to the next part. Now, in regards to the background battle soundtrack, Skin Deep, by both Brandon Yates and their Wolf Productions, which please correct me in the comment section if I'm wrong about this, but I think this is the first time we've ever seen Death Battle's two main music composers actually working together. They definitely do lots of features, but I think this is the first time they've ever combined their talents, which now that I think about it, why don't these two just work together more often to produce the best results possible? What's the point of really having some songs done by Brandon and then others done by their Wolf? I mean, unless there's some kind of clear stylistic distinction between the two, I really don't understand why they don't just team up more often, considering you have two really talented composers here. So I don't really see the point in separating them when you can bring them together to maximize the potential of your battle music. But getting into the actual soundtrack itself, once again, we are continuing the trend of more metal-themed music, which I have been clamoring for that Death Battle needs to start implementing more metal music. I find it to be more appropriate. Now, does every Death Battle soundtrack always have to be metal-themed? Maybe not necessarily, but like I've said before, it depends on the fight. For example, going back to my previous review, real quick, of Tomcat vs. Wile E. Coyote, if they were to use some metal soundtrack instead of the one that they actually used, it would have been incredibly out of place. Or if you tried using some super intense metal music in a joke death battle, unless you were trying to use it as an aspect of the joke itself, it would be out of place. So there definitely is a time and a place for other forms of music, so please don't try to tell me that I think that all the music needs to be metal themed in the same way that some people think that I believe all death battles need to be 3D animated. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying when it's appropriate, it is good to see metal music, because for action-based scenes, the best music, at least in my experience, that always enhances the scene the most is either some kind of orchestral music or some kind of heavy metal music is always the best thing to use. And thankfully, just like Ghost Rider vs. Spawn, they utilize that here. Which, given the god-awful music they used for Bardock vs. Omni-Man, now that is a death battle that could have really benefited from some metal-themed music. So I don't know what Brandon Yates was thinking there. Now, in regards to these two working together, while I don't know if I would say it necessarily gives us the best soundtrack possible, while I do think this is a good song, don't get me wrong, this is a very good song, but I don't think it's as good as Hell's Angels from Brandon Yates, which accompanies Spawn vs. Ghost Rider, which is definitely at least like top 1 or top 2 for best death battle soundtrack of all time, or the soundtrack from Sauron vs. the Lich King, which was made by their Wolf Productions, which is also either the top 1 or the top 2 best death battle soundtrack. And what I find interesting is the fact that these were songs that are both contenders for being the best death battle soundtrack, but these were songs that were made individually for the most part by these two composers, separate from each other. So you would think if you bring these two together, you would get something on a completely different level from both those soundtracks. And what I mean by that is, as cool as this song is, it lacks intensity, if that makes any sense. For example, when you think back to Hell's Angels from Spawn vs. Ghost Rider, that soundtrack was not only awesome and had great lyrics. Well, actually, I take that back. The lyrics kind of just only emphasize how much of a mirror matchup it is, but that being aside, the lyrics are fine for the most part. But what I want to focus on particularly with the music is in regards to that soundtrack, as well as the Sauron vs. the Lich King one. What they both have is
intensity, which helps enhance the dramatic nature of what's going on. Hell's Angels is not only a massive headbanger, but it's got really intense moments that really help make the fight feel more heavy. Now here, you don't really get that. It feels kind of soft, if that makes any sense. And I'm not really sure if this was a stylistic choice, or if it was just something didn't click well between these two. Maybe they both had conflicting visions, I'm not sure. Now, I don't think it necessarily ruins the song by any means. I do think that it's still worth noting that I do find this song to be a little soft and not as much of a banger as it could have been, because when it comes to metal music, you usually, unless it's meant to be more of like maybe some kind of somber or ballad, like maybe something like when Disturbed would make a remake of Sounds of Silence or something like that, or when Five Finger Death Punch will make a more somber, melancholy song like Wrong Side of Heaven or I Remember Everything. I'm not saying every metal song has to necessarily be a banger, but usually the rule usually tends to be that when it comes to metal music, you gotta make sure you've got some kind of intensity to make it feel like a bit of a banger, otherwise it makes me wonder, what are we doing here? Again, I don't think it's a major thing that brings down the song by any means, but what I will move on to is one thing I do think is interesting about this song is how it utilizes Japanese lyrics. And again, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think that's something we've ever gotten before in a death battle soundtrack. I'm aware that I haven't listened to every song by Wolf Media or Brandon Yates, but it is kind of cool seeing both these guys kind of pay respect to the Japanese roots of both these characters by implementing some Japanese lyrics, which is actually kind of cool to see. And it does make you think that maybe you could kind of like use this as like a pseudo OP for both of these anime, like if these anime came together and an OP was birthed from these two anime coming together. I do think that that's kind of cool. And I will be curious if, especially in regards to the anime matchups, if we see stuff like this more often. Now, I will admit, I don't really know what the lyrics translate to, and I don't know if there is a translation for these lyrics. And if anybody does have a translation, feel free to send it my way, because I can't speak too much about the actual lyrics itself, so I don't really know what they're singing about. So I can't really speak to that, but I do still find that to be an interesting touch. So overall, I would say this is a solid 6 or 7 out of 10 as far as soundtracks go. But another thing I'll say in regards to the soundtrack real quick is I do find it kind of cool and interesting that in certain parts of the actual death battle analysis, they're using like some kind of classical music. For example, in the shigaraki part of it. I will say death battle has definitely stepped up its game when it comes to background music in regards to the analysis. Don't get me wrong, it's not always the most necessary, but it does kind of help get certain vibes going when they're talking about certain things, especially if they're talking about more intense characters or more somber characters or more tragic characters. Like, for example, when it comes to like a horror themed matchup like Lucy and Carnage and Michael Myers vs. Jason Voorhees, it would make perfect sense for them to accompany something with a horror sounding soundtrack rather than just some generic stock music. So while it's not entirely necessary, I do like seeing death battle showing their more cultured side by implementing some kind of more classical music. So heavy props there, death battle. So overall, I definitely say that the soundtrack is very well implemented in both the background music for the actual death battle itself and the actual battle music itself. So, now let's get to the part that I'm sure you guys care about the most, the animation and battle. Now, this particular fight was animated by Moro and written by Liam Swan. And for those who might be curious as to who these people are, well, Moro is one of their animators, and from what I can gather, he's one of their new animators. He animated, Eggman versus Bowser, so we're definitely in good hands here. And as for this Liam Swan guy, well, he wrote... Oh no.
You son of a bitch! It's a travesty! I will kill you!
Come on, get him out of here. Get him out of here. Come on, Joe. No. Okay. All right. Careful, Peter.
Oh boy.
Okay, fine. I'm cool. I'm fine.
You know what? I'm starting to rethink who the true mastermind is behind all these god-awful death battle episodes, because almost every single really just objectively terrible, most hated death battle, almost all of them this guy seems to be responsible for. And I'm kind of surprised that, similar to Not Death Battle, this guy managed to elude me for so many years. But then again, if this man is the true mastermind behind all this shenanigans, then he must have a really great scapegoat, because for so many years I've been blaming Wiz and Boomstick for everything. Come to find out, most of this may not have even been entirely their fault, but hey, let's give the guy a chance. Maybe he's learned his lesson. After all, people are always capable of change, right? So, I would say, if I'm being honest with myself, this one actually isn't that badly written, and it's pretty well animated. Like, whoever this Moro guy is, the fact that this guy has only really animated, like, 6 to 8 death battles is certainly a travesty. Now, don't get me wrong, I'll say this much. When it comes to any death battle involving a DBZ character, those should absolutely be given to Devil's Artemis. No question about that. But what I will say is, at least when it comes to, like, the hand-drawn fights, I definitely think that should be left in the hands of this guy, because the guy is clearly talented and knows what he's doing. And, like I mentioned earlier, this is the same guy that animated Bowser vs. Eggman. And it shows. And I don't at all find it coincidental that, just like the meme I showed earlier, when people know that this guy is animating the fight, more people are going to come. In fact, all you would have to do is just say, this is the guy that animated Bowser vs. Eggman, and it's going to get butts in seats, because, as I've talked about before, Bowser vs. Eggman might be the first and possibly only perfect death battle, because that one was just so beautifully animated. And this isn't just good by, like, death battle standards, this is just good in general. I mean, sure, it doesn't look perfectly like the professional animation that you're going to get from a high-level animation studio, but looking at this from the perspective of, like, YouTube animations, this is really damn good. And there's not really a whole lot of flaws that I can find within it. If I had to nitpick, I guess I could say that certain parts of the animation do feel a little slow at times, or there are certain parts of the animation where, like, one character will hit another character, but it feels like the hits lack any kind of impact. Now, this isn't a problem throughout the entire animation, just like at certain points a character hits another one, and it just feels kind of weak. But it's not really like anything egregious. And just like with Bowser vs. Eggman, this is really solid. Now, I don't know if I would say it's as impressive as Bowser vs. Eggman, only because that one was really big and ambitious. That guy had to animate so much. He had to animate basically an entire war, whereas here he's basically only animating 2 people. But, like I said, this just goes with what I've been telling Death Battle for years. The moment they start moving over to hand-drawn animation, all of a sudden, everything looks a whole lot better. Like, could you imagine if this was animated even like 4 or 5 years ago? They would have most likely used some crappy whatever sprites they could have pulled off of Mugen, and it likely would have suffered as a result of it. Because people always ask me, why does it matter if the fight is 3D or hand-drawn? Well, it matters because when you make your own homemade animation, you are less restricted. You have more possibilities of what you can do rather than just being limited to whatever pre-made poses you have at your disposal. And as I've proven before in some of my older videos, if I am capable of producing even decent or high quality, not only 3D models, but animations on the rare occasions when I'm able to produce them, then what excuse does Death Battle have? Because I barely understand anything about animation. I'm not even a professional animator. So I've always argued that Death Battle has no excuse. And I find it interesting that once Death Battle goes back to being indie, all of a sudden their episodes start to get good again. But back to the point. So again, really well animated. I love a lot of the visuals, especially the visuals of the Domain expansion and the visual of Shigaraki when he's in his little like badass mode. I forget what it's called, but basically like his true form. It looks really, really cool. And you definitely want to have as many likable visuals as you can. You know, like almost everything in this looks very solid, very high quality. And it's like I've said for years to the Death Battle fans, you don't need millions and millions of dollars and 1,000 animators slaving away to create something good. All you need is just some talented animators and some talented script writers. That's all you really need. And the gore in this is also really well animated as well, which is good because one thing that people will often come to Death Battle for is to watch the creative ways in which they can watch characters be dismembered or killed in some kind of creative way. And that's always good to see, especially when you consider that YouTube is trying to shut that crap down. To hell with that. But speaking of script writing, how does our boy Liam hold up in this one, considering this is the guy that made Green Lantern vs. Ben 10 and Madara vs. Aizen? Well, thankfully, this one is actually mostly well written. Now, I will admit, it would have been nice for there to be a little bit more of a story here, other than, oh, Shigaraki heard that some really powerful guy was rampaging the area, and he decides to try to recruit him. Like, yeah, that's something, I guess, and I suppose that is in line with something Shigaraki would try to do, but it does feel like there could have been a little bit more. Like I said, usually the best Death Battle stories are the ones that are the most simple. And this one, I guess, gets the job done, but it does definitely feel like they could have had a little bit more of a reason for why these two are killing each other. But again, it's not like there's just like, oh, well, these two characters are fighting because reasons. Like, for example, in Blake vs. Mikasa, when Blake and Mikasa literally fight each other because Mikasa tells her to get out of this area, it's dangerous, and Blake for no reason decides to tell her fuck off, and then they fight, and it just makes Blake look fucking retarded. So thankfully you don't get that here, and from what I understand about Shigaraki and Mahito, they are in character. And I know that's one thing I regularly get on Death Battle for, when they don't even bother to keep the characters in character or have them behave as they should. Without going too deep into it, this was a massive problem with Madara versus Aizen, where neither Madara nor Aizen behave as they should, and they both do things that would make no sense for them to do. It feels as if it was written by somebody that has never seen an episode of Naruto or Bleach in their life. Thankfully, you don't get that here. And while I don't know much about Mahito, what little bit I know about him and what I know about Shigaraki, which is a little bit more, they do have both of them stay in character, and the banter between these two is also pretty solid. I love some of the one-liners back and forth, such as when Mahito makes fun of Shigaraki for using gamer lingo, and I love the final one-liner where he responds to Mahito's claim that Shigaraki needs to grow up because he's just a kid that was mad that daddy was mean to him and just wants to make it everybody else's problem. And I absolutely love how Shigaraki flips that back on Mahito, because it shows at that point in the fight that it's not just a battle of who is stronger, but it is a battle of mental will at that point, of who is truly fighting for something that is actually meaningful. You got one person that fights simply because they're a chaos agent, and one person that fights because he believes he has a reason behind his hatred. It doesn't seem like much, but I do love it when you have solid banter back and forth between the characters as opposed to absolutely nothing. And there's nothing that's like absolutely cringy or anything. Almost every one-liner in this fight is fairly solid. So, by and large, I would say I don't really have any problem with the writing or the animation in this one, and I hope we get to see more animations from this guy in the future, because, again, Death Battle, make this guy one of your main animators, because he is really, really freaking talented. And you definitely have found yourself a gold mine in this guy. So that is the animation and script. I would say very high quality given the circumstances, and I could nitpick some things, but I mostly see it as not really anything to worry about. For example, I could easily say that I feel like the fight could go on a little longer and it feels a little bit rushed, but would it really be necessary for me to point that out? No, because it's not like this is Batman versus Captain America, where the fight is like less than the amount of time it takes to microwave a Hot Pocket. So let's move on to the final analysis. So, in regards to the overall final analysis, I would say Death Battle hits the nail right on the head, because on the surface, this looks like an obvious stomp match, because when you look at the power differences and the stat difference between Mahito and Shigaraki, it looks like Shigaraki would utterly stomp Mahito, with him being continental to light speed, as well as being borderline unkillable, versus Mahito, who at best you could get at city block to town level and maybe sub-relativistic speed. But they at the very least do a good job of explaining that this fight doesn't come down to a matter of stat, because you have two characters that basically can't be killed through conventional means, especially in regards to Mahito. So it came down to who can basically destroy the other's soul, essentially. And I think the fact that this came down to Shigaraki's vestige and willpower versus Mahito's soul corruption and domain expansion was a good way of showing that, like I said, even though this looks like a stomp, it really isn't, because under normal circumstances, if this just came down to stats, then Mahito should get stomped. Not only that, but Shigaraki also has the better abilities, especially in regards to his decay ability, which alone would probably be enough to end this fight if it wasn't for the high levels of immortality that both characters possess. So I do give Death Battle props for that, and not just being lazy and saying, well, Shigaraki has better stats. Moving on, which would have been easy for Death Battle to do. And if they did do that, then I would be complaining for this being more of an obvious stomp match. But thankfully, that wasn't the case. And like I said, the animation, solid. The music, pretty solid as well. And like I said, if we can get more of this Morio guy, or however you pronounce his name, then the future of Death Battle is looking pretty bright. The writing is definitely a step up over some of the other schlock that Liam has given us. And believe me, Liam, you aren't escaping me anymore. I'm gonna be keeping a very close eye on you. And if you deserve the credit for your writing, then you will get the credit, but I'm not going to let Death Battle keep taking the fall every time you fuck something up. So you're off the hook this time. But the moment you try giving us another Madara versus Aizen, or a Green Lantern versus Ben 10, I'm going to be right there to throw you over my knee. So tread carefully, Liam. But yeah, I would say this is a pretty solid episode. Now, the question is it as good as Bowser vs. Eggman? I would say no. But what I will say about this fight is I will give it a very high 9 out of 10. Certainly a solid episode, but just not as good as Bowser vs. Eggman. And I think that Death Battle may have made an error in judgment in showing Bowser vs. Eggman as early as they did, because they basically played their hand a little too early. They perhaps should have saved that for the season finale instead of what the season finale is actually going to be, because now, since the bar has been set so high, depending on how good the rest of these episodes are, everything just looks shit in comparison, because now we're constantly comparing each episode by saying, well, this is a cool episode, but it's not as good as Bowser vs. Eggman, and I definitely think that might have been an error of judgment. But maybe I'm wrong, because maybe Death Battle does have more surprises in store for us. And if it can get better than Bowser vs. Eggman, then I think that that's something that all of us are going to look forward to. So once again, I give this a very high 9 out of 10. Very good episode all around. Good research, good final results. They get the victor right. They portray both characters accurately. The animation is beautiful. The music is solid, even if it's not the best soundtrack in the world, but not every Death Battle soundtrack needs to necessarily be the greatest song in the world, because you can't always expect perfection every single time. And you also can't rush perfection either. And I definitely do have to say that I feel like if this episode came out back when Death Battle was trying to force these episodes out every 2 weeks, then I do think this episode probably would have suffered. But thankfully, Death Battle seems to be learning their lesson, and I look forward to what Death Battle gives us next. Although I will say, I'm not really looking forward to the upcoming Death Battle involving Deku, but we'll save that one for when it comes. But you know me, I try not to be the be-all, end-all. What do you think of Shigaraki versus Mahito? Do you think that this was a good episode, or do you think that I'm being a little too forgiving? Let me know what you think in the comments below. Let me know which death battle you would like me to cover next while we wait for Deku versus Miles, and I will see you guys around for the next review.
Back again, Shady's back.